The stench rising from her chamber was so overwhelming that even the most seasoned courtiers, men who had survived battlefields, famines, and disease, found themselves stumbling backward, hands pressed to their mouths, eyes watering. Thus began the final torment of Agnes Sorel, the woman whose unmatched beauty had once reshaped the destiny of France, and whose death would become a legend whispered with fear, envy, and revulsion. This is not fiction, it is the rotting truth, hidden behind silk ribbons and royal tapestries. And if you're ready to descend into today's tale, tap that subscribe button and prepare yourself, cause not everyone has the stomach to witness the fall of a woman who once embodied perfection itself. Agnes Sorel had ruled the court of Charles II not with a crown, but with her presence. Chroniclers praised her as the Lady of Beauty, the first official royal favourite, the woman courageous enough to stand at the king's side when the Valois throne trembled. She walked through the halls of Chinon like an apparition of light, her gowns shimmering with pearls, her skin so luminous that poets swore candle flames bent toward her. Soldiers adored her, ministers feared her. The king himself, long paralyzed by doubt, breathed differently in her presence. But beauty is no armor against what grows unseen. In the early weeks of January 1450, Agnes returned from a long journey, exhausted by cold roads and diplomatic obligations. She had felt unwell during the final days of her travel, intermittent cramps, a strange churning beneath her ribs, but attributed it to fatigue. Yet that night, as she lay in the royal apartments prepared for her at Le Mesnil, she awoke with a jolt, clutching her abdomen. A twisting sensation ripped through her stomach with such force that she slid from her bed, knees striking the floor, breath caught in her throat. Her cries were muffled by the luxurious furs lining the chamber. At dawn, she insisted she was fine. She greeted the king's messengers with her usual serenity, though her face had lost its color. She inhaled mint water to steady herself, and ordered her hair arranged in intricate curls to conceal her trembling. Appearance was a political weapon, and Agnes wielded it with precision. But the servants closest to her had already noticed something wrong. Her breath carried an odd, sickly sweetness, the unmistakable scent of something decomposing far beneath the surface of the skin. When she leaned forward, a faint but persistent odor rose from her body, causing even the boldest chambermaid to avert her gaze. By the third day, the pain sharpened. Agnes felt something shifting inside her, as if a living cord were tightening around her organs. She doubled over each time she tried to cross the room. Her belly began to swell, not like a gentle rounding, but as though a pressure from within pushed outward in violent pulses. She pressed her hands against her abdomen, horrified to feel sudden movements, brief serpentine twists that made her gasp. She whispered prayers under her breath, begging for the sensation to stop. Servants exchanged terrified glances. The court physicians summoned in haste muttered about disturbed humors and corrupted bile, yet none dared name what their experience secretly suggested, an invasion of the intestines by creatures. But how could they speak such a disgrace aloud to the king's beloved? How could they suggest that the most admired woman in France was being eaten alive from the inside? Agnes attempted to mask the truth. She wore heavier gowns, cinched tighter than usual. She burned ambergris, lavender, and rosemary in bronze censers to combat the odor slowly filling her rooms. But nothing hid the fact that her beauty, her weapon, her shield, was beginning to crack. At meals she could hardly swallow. The moment food touched her tongue, nausea rose like a tide. Her appetite vanished. Her once radiant skin grew dull, then clammy, then mottled with an unhealthy grey. She shivered constantly, despite layers of velvet and fur. At night she slept only in brief intervals, waking drenched in sweat, her heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. And still she said nothing. But rumors do not wait for truth to take shape. The courtiers noticed her absence from festivities. They whispered about her altered gait, her trembling hands, her refusal to let anyone near her bedchamber. Some insisted she had been poisoned by rivals, jealous of her power. Others murmured about divine punishment, God's retribution for a love that defied marriage and propriety. Charles II attempted to visit her, but Agnes refused, pleading exhaustion. "I am merely weary from travel," she insisted through pale lips. "A few days of rest will restore me." But the king heard her voice falter, and when she turned away to cough, he caught a glimpse of pain twisting her features into a grimace far from her usual composure. By the beginning of the second week, the situation escalated. The swelling in her abdomen grew more pronounced. Bouts of agony struck without warning, forcing her to grip the edge of tables or collapse against walls. She began vomiting violently, producing not only bile but fragments of something thin, white and writhing. The maid who witnessed this fled the room screaming, convinced she had seen demons emerging from the favourite's throat. Physicians were summoned again. This time they could not hide the truth. In hushed voices they confessed that Agnes was likely suffering from a severe infestation of ascaris worms, long, pale, serpentine parasites that coil within the gut and rise into the stomach when the body weakens. Such creatures thrived in contaminated food and water. They grew by the dozens, sometimes hundreds, feeding on their host until the host could no longer endure their presence. The news spread through the palace like wildfire. Courtiers avoided her corridor entirely. Servants begged to be reassigned. Even the priests hesitated, unsure whether this was an illness or a spiritual affliction. Agnes, once the jewel of France, found herself alone. As days passed, the odour intensified. It was not merely the smell of sickness. It was the scent of internal decay. The parasites had multiplied, causing blockages, inflammation and internal bleeding. Her fever rose, sweat poured from her body. Her long golden hair clung to her temples. Her eyes sunk deep into their sockets, yet she remained lucid enough to understand what was happening. The worms were not simply killing her, they were consuming her radiance, her influence, her legacy, and she could do nothing to stop them. The decline of Agnes Sorel unfolded with a swiftness that terrified even those who envied her. Within days, her condition deteriorated into something the court had no words to describe. The palace at Le Mesnil, once fragrant with imported resins and warm wine, now reeked of sickness, an odour sharp and persistent, the unmistakable breath of a body under siege. Servants tiptoed through corridors as though afraid the very walls might absorb the stench and whisper it back to them. By then, everyone knew the king's beloved was dying, and dying badly. Agnes could no longer stand without assistance. When she tried to rise, a pressure surged inside her abdomen, as if something enormous pressed outward, threatening to rupture through her skin. She gripped her belly with trembling fingers, feeling movement, subtle at first, then unmistakable. A slow, crawling sensation rippled beneath her ribs. She gasped, biting down on a scream, her nails digging into her flesh. She had once carried royal children inside her body. Now it was host to crawling invaders, each feeding, multiplying, writhing in secret darkness. The physicians attempted again to calm the court's panic. They brought bitter purgatives, powders crushed from wormwood and tansy, concoctions brewed from honey and salt. They forced her to drink viscous liquids so potent they burned her throat, but nothing stayed in her stomach. Hours later, the maids found her vomiting violently onto the tiled floor, blood, bile, and long, twisting shapes that writhed briefly before lying still. One maid fainted at the sight. Another fled the chamber, shrieking that she had seen the favourite's very soul leaving her in white serpents. Though the priest scolded such hysteria, the rumour grew that Agnes was possessed, punished by heaven for the boldness of her beauty and her place at the king's side. Some whispered she had been cursed by enemies jealous of her influence. Others claimed she had been poisoned, not to kill her outright, but to rot her from within. Charles VII, tormented by doubt and dread, demanded answers. He summoned the physicians to his private study, slamming his hand upon the table until his signet ring cut into the wood. But the physicians lowered their eyes. No purgative, no bleeding, no recitation of prayers could reverse what had begun. The king insisted on seeing her. Agnes resisted, out of pride, fear, and shame. But Charles would not be dissuaded. When he entered the chamber, he found her sitting upright, trying desperately to appear composed. But the illusion shattered the moment she shifted her weight. Pain cinched her waist, and she doubled over with a stifled moan. Her hair, once a bright cascade of silver gold, clung in dark strands to her damp forehead. By then, the court was fracturing under the weight of the scandal. Some advisers urged the king to distance himself, to focus on the war effort, to hide the favourite's suffering before rumours destroyed the monarchy's dignity. Others begged him to bring in foreign physicians, alchemists, even mystics. But the truth remained horrifyingly simple. Agnes was being consumed. On the morning of the 8th day she collapsed while attempting to rise from her bed. A sound like a low, strangled cry escaped her as she crumpled to the floorboards. Maids rushed to her side, but when they lifted her, they recoiled in horror. Her abdomen, already grotesquely distended, had grown taut as a drum. The skin looked stretched to its limit, veins visible beneath the pale surface. Every breath she took sent ripples of movement through her belly. The chief physician, his hand shaking, knelt to examine her. When he pressed his palm lightly against her abdomen, she screamed, a raw primal sound that filled the entire corridor. Something inside her shifted violently in response, as though disturbed by the intrusion. One servant fled, swearing she had seen a bulge move beneath the skin like a creature trying to escape. The physician ordered everyone out. When the door closed, he leaned over Agnes and whispered prayers he barely remembered. Never had he seen a noblewoman infested so severely that the creatures inside her created visible waves beneath her flesh. He poured wine laced with crushed herbs into her mouth, trying to force her body to expel what remained inside. But Agnes vomited it all back up, along with more worms tangled in mucus and blood. By midday, the odor in her chamber had become unbearable. It clung to fabric, seeped into wood, settled in the hair and clothes of anyone who entered. No one wanted to return. But the king ordered that she never be left alone. Thus courtiers and attendants, men and women, accustomed to silks, jewels and measured elegance, found themselves standing guard at her bedside, clinging to perfumed cloths pressed against their faces. They watched her writhe in agony, watched sweat roll down her temples, watched the tremors that shook her body as she tried to keep herself upright. At night they heard her whispering, sometimes prayers, sometimes fragments of memories. One night she woke with a choked gasp clutching her throat. She felt something rising, not metaphorically, but literally. A pressure climbed her esophagus. She gagged, her eyes widening in terror. The maids rushed to lift her upright just as she began to retch. A torrent of bile surged from her mouth, and within it, long pale worms glistening in the candlelight as they hit the floor. The maids dropped her in shock. Her head struck the wooden bed frame, but Agnes did not seem to feel the impact. She was staring at the creatures writhing at her feet, a trembling hand lifting weakly as though to ward off the sight. The woman once praised as the very embodiment of heavenly beauty was now reduced to a hollow vessel, her body no longer her own. And outside her chamber the court trembled, not only for her fate, but for what her suffering revealed about the fragility of those who lived closest to power. By the 10th day, the chateau no longer resembled a royal residence. It felt instead like a place haunted by the slow, audible suffering of a woman whose agony seeped through every stone corridor. Whispers carried from one wing to another, never loud enough to be overheard by the king, yet unmistakable in tone, dread, superstition, and a growing belief that Agnes Sorel's torment was no ordinary illness. Something unholy, they said, was feeding on her, something alive. To protect her, or perhaps to protect themselves, the courtiers had taken to lighting candles in every hallway, stuffing herbs beneath doorframes, scattering salt across thresholds. Some wore amulets blessed by trembling priests. Others refused to touch food prepared in the same kitchen that supplied Agnes's chamber. No one could agree whether the worms that ravaged her belonged to natural disease, witchcraft, poison, or divine punishment. But all agreed on one thing: the king's favorite was being destroyed from within in a manner too grotesque to speak of openly. Agnes, once surrounded by admirers and attendants, now found herself isolated not by command but by fear. Only a handful of servants, those too loyal, too poor, or too terrified to refuse, remained by her side. Even they avoided her gaze as if looking too closely at her suffering might draw misfortune upon themselves. When they approached to wash her, their movements were quick and careful, their faces turned away as much as possible. The illness had twisted her features. The delicate symmetry of her face had become gaunt and hollow, her cheeks drawn tight against her bones. Her lips, once soft and warm, had cracked and taken on a blue-grey hue. Her eyes, those brilliant pale gems that once could command the king's entire attention, now flickered with fever, alternating between startling clarity and distant haze. But the most terrifying change remained her abdomen. It no longer resembled the body of a young woman. It had swollen into a grotesque mound, stretched taut and shining with fevered sweat. At times it pulsed visibly, at others it shivered with subtle serpentine contortions beneath the skin. Even the bravest physicians dared touch her, only briefly, afraid of provoking another internal shift. Her body had become a battlefield the court could only watch from the edges, helpless, On the 11th evening, a storm raged outside. Wind battered the shutters, rain hammered against the stone wall. As though nature itself recoiled from the spectacle within, Agnes lay curled on her side, gasping between waves of pain. She had not eaten in nearly a day. Whatever she swallowed was rejected violently by her body. Her breaths came in short, broken patterns, each punctuated by a low moan. As night deepened, the candles near her bedside burned low. Agnes stirred and murmured something unintelligible. Her body jerked suddenly, one violent spasm, then another. She clutched her abdomen and screamed. Isabeau called for help. 2 physicians rushed in, their expressions grim. They held her down as the spasm continued, her back arching, her thighs trembling. Sweat poured down her temples. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as her belly heaved upward in a single grotesque bulge. One physician pressed lightly against the swollen mound. Agnes shrieked. Something beneath the skin shifted upward, slowly, deliberately, before sinking back into the depths of her abdomen. The physician jerked away, face drained of all color. Agnes collapsed back onto the mattress, exhausted. Tears streamed from the corners of her eyes. What sin, she whispered, barely audible, could justify this? No one dared answer. Outside her chamber, chaos simmered. Ministers argued over whether to keep the illness secret. Soldiers posted outside her wing begged to be reassigned. Some courtiers fled the chateau entirely, abandoning positions they had waited years to obtain. Others drafted messages to their families, certain the palace was cursed. Rumors grew louder. Some claimed to have seen worms crawling beneath the floorboards, escaping from her chamber. Others whispered that her beauty had attracted demons. By the 12th day, even the king was forbidden from entering by his advisors, who feared the scandal that might result if he witnessed the full horror of her condition. Charles VII ignored them at first, but after seeing her collapse, he began to retreat, not from her in spirit, but from the physical reality of her suffering, which he felt powerless to stop. He remained outside her door for hours each day, listening. Agnes sensed his presence. Even in delirium, she would whisper, "Is he there? Does he still love me?" But no one had the courage to tell her the truth, that the king, unable to bear her agony or his own powerlessness, hovered just out of reach like a ghost. By the 14th day, she could no longer rise from her bed. The worms inside her had multiplied so dramatically that her stomach seemed perpetually in motion. Her skin felt hot to the touch. Fever surged through her veins like wildfire. At times she babbled incoherently, recalling old memories. At others she hallucinated, insisting she felt things crawling up her throat or down her legs. Isabeau tried to soothe her, but Agnes seized her wrist with surprising strength. Isabeau shook her head, terror tightening her throat. "There is nothing there, madame. Nothing but illness." Then she convulsed again. The physicians rushed in once more. The convulsions lasted nearly half an hour, until Agnes lay limp, her breath shallow. They looked upon her swollen form, on the trembling skin, the unnatural tension in her abdomen, the faint ripples that coursed beneath her surface, and they knew she was not recovering. She was disappearing, and all of them knew what was coming next would be worse. By the 15th day, the chateau was unrecognizable. Silence wrapped the corridors like a shroud. Tapestries hung untouched, candles burned low and unattended, and the voices that once filled the halls with gossip and music had vanished entirely. Inside her chamber, Agnes Sorel lay motionless on the bed that had once symbolized her power at court. Now she looked drained, hollow, and impossibly frail, as though the very structure of her body had begun to collapse inward. The fever had burned away the last of her strength. Her skin, once compared to pearl and alabaster, was sallow and slick with sweat. Her abdomen, however, remained monstrous. It had grown beyond anything humanly recognizable. The swollen mound pushed her nightgown upward, stretching the fabric into a tight shell. At times, faint ripples coursed beneath the skin in slow, unsettling waves, as though something inside her refused to die with her. The physicians no longer touched her unless absolutely necessary. Whenever they placed a hand near her stomach, Agnes cried out, not in the delicate gasp of a courtesan, but in a raw, anguished scream that pierced through even the thickest walls. Inside, Agnes drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she recognized the people around her. Sometimes she whispered fragments of prayers. Other times, she mumbled incoherent words, trapped in a world of fever and shadows. At rare intervals, clarity pierced the fog. During one such moment, she reached for Isabeau's hand. The truth was cruel. The court already whispered about Agnes's demise as a spectacle rather than a tragedy. They claimed she had flown too close to the sun, that a woman favored by a king had been punished by the natural order. But no poison was needed when worms could do the work silently. Near dawn on the 16th day, Agnes began to tremble violently. Her body arched upward despite her weakness, her hands clutching the sheets. A harsh, rattling breath escaped her. The physicians rushed to her bedside, murmuring orders. Her stomach surged upward in a wave so dramatic that everyone present gasped. Agnes's eyes flew open, pupils constricting with terror. One of the physicians attempted to calm her, but the next instant she gagged violently, convulsing with such force that the bed rattled. A horrific sound escaped her throat, half gurgle, half scream, as something pressed upward inside her chest. Then she retched violently. Worms spilled from her mouth along with bile and blood. The room erupted in panic. One maid fainted on the spot. Another ran for the corridor, sobbing. The physician stumbled backward, covering his mouth. Agnes fell back onto her pillow, gasping as though drowning on dry land. But now she was beyond fear. Her eyes no longer focused. Her breaths came in shallow, rapid bursts. Her fingers twitched uselessly against the linen. The room blurred around her. Isabeau knelt beside her, tears streaming freely now, and then her breath left her in a long, trembling sigh. Her body collapsed into stillness. The room fell silent. Only the storm outside dared make a sound. When news reached Charles VII, he did not cry out. He did not collapse. He simply closed his eyes and let his sword slip from his hand. The woman who had revived his courage, who had restored his joy, who had stood beside him like no other, gone. Taken not by treason or war, but by something so small and merciless, it could not be seen until it was too late. The court moved with fearful haste. Her chamber was sealed. The servants scrubbed their hands until their skin cracked. Priests were summoned. Physicians argued over what had killed her. Though the truth was obvious, the worms had consumed her intestines, ruptured organs, and caused an infection that ravaged her entire body. Rumors spread that an autopsy had been ordered, not out of medical curiosity, but to silence whispers of poison. When her abdomen was opened, the truth became undeniable. Her intestines were swollen, inflamed, and filled with coiling parasites, some still alive. The shock was enough to silence every conspiracy. In death, Agnes Sorel had revealed a truth more terrifying than any political scheme. Even the most powerful, the most beautiful, the most beloved, could be undone by what thrived unseen. Her funeral procession was swift, solemn, and overshadowed by fear. Few dared approach the coffin, afraid the stench of death might cling to them. The king ordered her buried with honors befitting her status. Yet no musician played, no crowd gathered. Only the wind carried her memory forward. For years afterward, courtiers avoided speaking her name. The tale of her death lingered in silence, as though the worms that devoured her body had taken her legacy with them. But history remembers what the court tries to bury, and Agnes, brilliant, radiant, destroyed, remains a haunting reminder of how fragile power can be, how quickly beauty can rot, and how mercilessly the smallest of creatures can reduce a legend to dust. In the end, it was not scandal, nor treason, nor betrayal, that killed the king's beloved. It was hunger, the hunger of worms, and the silence of a court too frightened to intervene.